Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the EFTA House and to you out there as well. So my name is Marit, Andria. I am the director of the Internal Market Division here at the EFTA Secretariat. That division, or this division, is what we like to call really the heart of the EEA agreement. We have the responsibility of all the policy areas covered by the EEA agreement. And that's the preparation of each and every a legal act that will be taken into the EEA agreement. And as you heard Sid was saying, we are assisting our member states, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, when it comes to the EEA agreement, to prepare and to manage the EEA, to prepare for the incorporation and all these legal acts, and thus managing the EEA agreement. I will introduce you to this work, and I will also show a bit the role of the Secretariat in this respect. And finally, I will highlight two areas that we are dealing with, which is it's partly inside and outside the agreement, but something that is really, it's a big high on the agenda because we are living in changing times, as you know. So first, from EU to EEA. This is an outline of how both the Secretariat and our member states are taking part into the to the development of EU law and then to make it into EEA law. As you see at an early stage, before when the EU is already preparing their proposals, we have our experts meeting in the Commission expert groups. We are working on the proposals at an early stage. We are furthermore into it when the proposal is, informally we participate when the Commission is sending their proposals over to the member states in the Council and to the European Parliament. Then we have a very big role when the formal process of getting it into the EEA agreement starts, and our job, so to say, ends more or less at the moment when things are into the EEA agreement. But we assist along the way, and I will try to tell you a bit on that. So, but to understand what we are talking about here in numbers, I would like to say a few key numbers to you. So at the beginning, when we signed the agreement in 1992, we incorporated 1,875 legal acts. And I think it's important to bear in mind that the EEA agreement, of course, as you know, is very different from a normal free trade agreement because it covers so much. I have been told by the expert on free trade agreements that free trade agreements are looking into the future, and we are sort of agreeing on not to treat each other worse than we are doing today. Sort of, that's the main principle, said, of course, very, very simplified. We already took on quite a few acts. Since then, more than some 14,000 acts have been incorporated into the agreement. Only last year we did around 700. And about 6,000 acts is in force today because, of course, of those 14,000, some are outdated, some are replaced by others. So this is important numbers, but it says a bit about what we're really dealing with here. Food and veterinary area counts for about 35% every year of all the acts incorporated, ensuring a frictionless export of seafood and agriculture, and to make sure that we have food safety and food security in line with what they have, with what we have all over the internal market. There are no veterinary import or export controls, only customs that we are outside the customs union. Other important big high volume sectors are transport in general, and then air, road, rail, and maritime transport. Financial services is a big chunk, and the EU is producing numbers and acts in high numbers all the time, which of course also takes a lot of time, and they're complex. So this also has to be into our agreement. And also I can mention goods where all the technical regulations and specifications to the trade of goods is a part of it. We have already heard a bit earlier today some characteristics of the EEA agreement. The principle of homogeneity. It is a dynamic nature of this agreement because we keep on putting all these acts in. And it is consensus-based in the sense that to take something into the agreement is unanimously decided by the EFTA states on one side and the EU side on the other side. This sounds all good, but there are some challenges. To achieve homogeneity, it requires speedy incorporation. And the EEA process, which is the process to get the EU law into the EEA agreement, it takes time by nature. And why is that? Well, because even if we are involved at an early stage on the development process of the agreement, the formal process only starts when the EU side has already decided and published a new legal act. Increased complexity of EU acts. It makes it, of course, even more workload to understand what this really is. Not to mention, Siri showed you the scope of the agreement, and very often, and most of the times, it's quite easy to say if something is inside or outside the agreement. But because of, as you know, the big strategies that the EU is having, they're having Green Deal, they're having the digital decade. It goes on areas both inside and outside the agreement, also because the EEA or the EU has changed a lot since 1992 when we signed our agreement. So some parts was not even thought of when we started. For instance, agencies. I think it's probably the best and most known part of that, where yes, we cooperate and we, to a certain extent, participate in some of these agencies, but there are certain elements of these agencies that we cannot take into the agreement because it's not supposed to be in there. So then we have to come up with creative ideas on how to be a part of this work. At the same time, it has to fit with the agreement. Yes, and that was the new powers that I was talking about given to EU authorities. Increased volume of acts, I'll show you a bit later on that, but of course EU is also pumping out a lot of legal acts because also our societies become more and more complex. Other challenges that we have faced recently, Brexit. Definitely it would affect our countries, but we were of course not a part of the negotiations because we are not EU members. But since we are part of the EU, the internal market, we had to find solutions. COVID-19, in a few days, the internal market just shut down, as my screen did at the same time. And it was supposed to do. At the same time, we all know that we had to have some medicine, transport of foods, and not to mention free movement of some categories of people so that we could have our healthcare workers going from hospitals from if they live in one place and had to go to another. So there again, of course, as you know, an enormous amount was made, and normally it could take from 9 months to 1 year to get a legal act into the agreement. Here we were jumping around and finding solutions in only a few days. And of course, finally, the war in Ukraine. I will come back to that a bit later. Two-pillar structure you saw a bit earlier, again by Siri. That is the setup, but of course we have eminent ambassadors in our countries for representing us to the EU, but they are not dealing with the nitty-gritty details. So when there has been a meeting in the Standing Committee that agrees on which legal acts to incorporate into the agreement, a lot of work has been done before. And that work can be for many years, and here is maybe the key area, a key part of what we are doing in the Secretariat. Because the Standing Committee of the EFTA states is supported by 4 subcommittees. As you can see, you recognize the areas: free movement of goods, services and capital, persons, and finally some horizontal policies and flanking issues. They are, and also a 5th subcommittee, legal and institutional matters, that doesn't really have the policy areas of the agreement responsible for that, but more the overall legal affairs. Under each subcommittee, there are the responsibility of all the policies in the EEA agreement. You see all these groups here are actually EFTA expert groups and working groups. They meet very often here in the house. During COVID, we have, of course, also learned to meet online. But we have learned also after COVID that the best combination is, the best solution is actually the combination of the two. Because when things get complicated, we need to be around the same table and trying to find solution. So whenever there is either a new act or a new policy, these groups will meet and they will process the work. In my division, we have 12 policy officers that have divided all these groups in between them. And we have 3 legal officers who are responsible for drafting all the committee decisions that finally takes a legal act into the EEA agreement. So you can imagine that is quite comprehensive work, and we're never really bored in this house. So that's the upside of it. So basically, 2 main strands of the EEA work. As been mentioned before, we are dealing with decision shaping, which is participating in development of EU legislation before EU has adopted a new legal act, and decision making, incorporation of the EEA agreement of an adopted EEA relevant act. And I'll say very shortly about that because you will hear more about that later on. There are several channels for us to participate. As you know, when things go to the Council and European Parliament, we don't have a formal role. It doesn't mean that we cannot try and tweak and talk to people to come with our ideas and thoughts on how a legal act should be or which direction they should go. But before that, we have, through the agreement, some rights to be consulted at the same level as member states. That we do through formal participation in EU expert groups and committees. Then because we have these working groups that I just showed you, and the Secretariat is also following up and paying attention to new strategies. I mean, yesterday was the State of the Union speech by von der Leyen is also something that we, of course, with a lot of bureaucrats around in our states would follow, because here you often get signals of new directions. This enables us to have an early assessment by our experts and with the cooperation of our team of EEA challenges. Sometimes, and it's not because we want EU legislation to be what we with the EEA glasses needs as a small country in Europe. It is more it needs to fit in. But it is a good way of highlighting issues that can be challenging to us, and maybe little tweaks can make it work better. EFTA comments, you will have a very good presentation of my excellent colleague Trond later on this afternoon on that. That's how the EFTA countries are deciding on positions, and we can through that present that to our colleagues on the EU side. Then, of course, informal contacts. We in the Secretariat, we do not do the lobbying part, but of course we are assisting our member states to reach out to whomever they need to reach out to. Finally, I would like to mention also secondment of national experts to the Commission. This is not, of course, something that we do to make to have spies in the EU system, but it's basically a system where our experts, who are excellent in their field, contribute to the development of the EU legislation. When they are there, they of course work for the European Commission. Having said that, they are coming with their background, their knowledge, and their views, which can be useful in any kind of process. The decision-making process you will hear all about later from my excellent colleague Finnur, who will talk you through that this afternoon. But this is, of course, one of the core business that we're doing in the Secretariat, assisting to make sure that all these legal acts that I've been talking about are incorporating very swiftly. And numbers, I promised you some numbers. If you look at the yellow, or the orange line there, which is sort of steady, going a bit up and down every now and then. But still, these are all the acts that are adopted in the EU and that should be taken into the EEA agreement. Quite a few. I mean, the good news is that even if it has a peak up there, I think we are sort of peaking it downwards a bit again. But yes, there is a big so-called, what we call the backlog. It means that because as the process, as I said, we are not able to process all these acts so that they are sort of lagging a bit behind. But if you see, not on the second column of green and blue there, but the other one, because we are only in September in 2022. But if you look at the one of 2021, you see that the green one, which is acts identified and acts incorporated every year, and if you add the pale blue one, which is acts excluded, EU acts that are not relevant for the EEA agreement, you see that in fact we're not too bad off. Last year we were incorporating almost as many acts as was identified. So this backlog has also, of course, to be seen with the fact that EU is producing a lot of massive, complex acts, and the number of acts are increasing. But it's good to have in the back of your mind that this is really a huge machinery. Then back to those 2 points that I wanted to raise in the end. So, as you also saw the scope, and a very important part of our cooperation with the EU is our participation in the EU programs. This is something that is stated in the EEA agreement, and we have the possibility to participate in the programs that our countries prioritize for us to participate in. The legal base is part 4 of the EEA agreement, and this is also a cooperation outside the 4 freedoms. The financial contribution is quite enormous, and for 2021 it was close to 2022 it should be, shouldn't it, Torstein? 2022 it should be around 600 millions. Am I right? Yeah, I just see that there the 2 has become a 1 there. But this year we, and that is probably my fault, just to state that. So for 2021 it was close to 600 million euros, which is of course quite substantial. But then we are able to participate in programs such as, of course, the most known one is Erasmus. Some of you in this room has probably even been taking part of that, when our young students can, or young citizens can go to study abroad. But also, of course, research and innovation is crucial to our countries. This is all about building a sustainable Europe, finding solutions that our countries cannot necessarily do alone, and of course take part in the technology development, and not to mention one of the biggest tasks we have, of course, at the moment is to ensure or to do something about the climate changes and our environment. Yeah. And of course, then when it comes to the scale of this, Horizon Europe and Erasmus accounts for almost 2/3 of the total EEA/EFTA budget. This is what we're going to participate in 21 to 27. All of these programs, the legal acts that shapes this program is now taken into the EEA agreement. If you want to read more about the programs, you will see you can find that on our website as well. And in red there, you see which of our countries are participating in what. Then, we are in changing and challenging times, and that we have also noticed in the EFTA Secretariat. COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, it really made us have to turn our work upside down and incorporate things in a speed that we have never done before. I think over those years that the pandemic lasted at the highest level, there was a trust built not only within the EU, but I mean, increased, I should say, because I feel that we have a lot of trust between us and the EU. Because they saw that we wanted to contribute, we were able to do things quickly and swiftly, all in to try to handle the pandemic that we have, for at least part of it, behind us. It's not all over the world as we read, but still within the EU. More than 100 COVID-19 related acts was incorporated since 2020. And even if it's quite calm, I mean, we're still not really done. 30 acts have been incorporated through so-called special urgent written procedures. These are the ones I was talking about that took, I think, 3 days. And some are even ready, I think, already next week when our ambassadors are meeting the EU side on next Friday. Another 8 acts will be incorporated. I think, I mean, we had about a week, and then there were, when sort of we felt that COVID was at least the stage where we could put it a bit behind us. Then the invasion of Ukraine started. I think that because of what we had done and discovered through COVID, we were able to meet that quite swiftly also, both within the EU, but also the relations with us and the EU side. We already had a system set up in the Secretariat to follow the developments in the EU, like we had done on COVID issues. We were taken into discussions, although part of this, or most of this actually, is not a part of the EEA agreement because it relates to third countries outside the EU. So what we like to say is that the EU measures on Ukraine are not really EU relevant in the sense of the agreement, but it's definitely relevant to the EEA. Sorry, EEA relevant, but it's definitely relevant to the EEA. Some of the legal acts are EEA relevant, though, because they are changing, for instance, legislation that is already inside the EEA agreement. So far, there has been 2 acts incorporated in regarding food chain. This is, of course, to make the transport and the export-import of food to Ukraine as flexible as possible in a country where they might not have electricity, nor email, nor printers. So that's something to do with certificates and so on, so that we can do things swiftly. Also on transport, there is one act identified, but it's not as urgent, so that will go through a normal procedure. The role of the Secretariat in this respect is that we have been measuring all measures adopted, or we monitor all the measures, and we are then informing our member states as soon as possible. And then we assist our member states to make sure that the relevant acts are highlighted and that we can do this as soon as possible. I think this was what I wanted to say as an overview of what we do in the Secretariat. If you have any questions, of course, we are more than happy to reply, and you will hear more about some of these things later. Does anyone have a question? Or was it all clear? Yes, please. Do you have a...
I'm coming with a mic.
And of course, you can also have questions to Siri if you have.
I have a question regarding EEA relevance. Where I said, does it ever happen that the two sides disagree on the relevance of an act? And if so, sort of how you would solve a situation like that? So if the EU believes the act is relevant and, for example, EFTA doesn't, or vice versa?
Yeah. Thank you. That is a very good question. As I mentioned, when a legal act is adopted, we are capturing that and registering that in our system. The EU often marks it as EEA relevant, and sometimes they don't. The core point here is that, so that sort of starts our assessment of it. Whether it's EEA relevant or not depends on whether it's inside the scope of the EEA agreement or not. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, that sounds really simple. But when you now have acts that have something inside and something outside. So this is something we assess all along. Yes, it happens that our 3 countries are not agreeing at the first instance. And then we have to discuss that, and that happens in those working groups, as I showed earlier. And then sometimes it also happens that the EU thinks something is relevant, and we think it is not, and the other way around. How we solve that normally is that we could take out part of whatever that regulation is which is not EA relevant, and still incorporate the rest of it. That's what we're doing, so-called adoptions to that decision, which takes in this legal act into the EA agreement. This you will know much more about later on today. And if it comes to the point that we really do not agree at all, that's something which is discussed with our ambassadors and the EU side in the standing committee. In the joint committee, where the EU side meets our side. If they don't agree, there is no such thing there is no, arbitration or anything. That's just, then the parties agree that they don't agree, and nothing really, it doesn't happen. I don't think, from my understanding, and now those of you who would disagree, this has not really come to that point that we have ever not, that we couldn't agree that it's inside or outside, or that has been a problem. I think it could have been that it has been hanging there for a while, but in the end, maybe because of developments or our EFTA states have decided that they want to take it in. We also have some tricks and tweaks to put it in the agreement anyway, even if we think it is not really a part of the core part of the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Marit. We are actually also getting quite a few questions via the chat, so our online participants are also clearly listening. The first one is actually about the EEA and Norway grants. So if you think it's more appropriate that we answer it after Eva Klöve's presentation, it's about what impact will the war in Ukraine have on the EEA and Norway grants?
I think that is absolutely a question that our FMO friends would be more
better placed to answer. So we will come back to that question.
Yeah.
Alexandra, thank you for your question. We will come back to it after lunch, when our colleague from the EEA Norway grants will actually give her presentation. Then Erik Hansen asks, what is the impact of Brexit on the EEA EFTA, and does it impact or influence the EEA agreement?
Oh, that's another very good question. You want me to, well, first of all, as I said, it impacted us in the agreement between EU and UK, impacted, of course, us because it had implications on the internal market. That's also why, speaking for Norway, that I know better, have made their own decision. I think, and the political side of it, I will not go too much into, but I think on the working level, I think it has been a lot more awareness in the EU of this inside-outside cherry-picking not. We faced that, I have to say, a bit, maybe more in the beginning than now, in the sense that when we need those adoptions to make EU law, EEA law, which in reality is just because both EU and we have agreed on the EEA agreement, and it should fit into that framework. We can have, we can have case handlers or whatever, or not only case handlers, but we can have counterparts on the EU side saying, but these adoptions, you cannot just come and pick and choose and so on. So a bit of skepticism, I would say, that we face in our daily work, or at least did in the beginning. But I think that also means that we have to be, and I would also add the pandemic, because we have all been sitting on our home offices. So I think one of the most important we can do to try and, oil the machinery again is to again go and talk to our counterparts. Some of them know EEA excellently and really, really well, and others are new or whatever. So that's why we in this house are inviting our colleagues to EFTA house visits, to basically explain a lot of the things that we have explained to you today, and you will hear more about today, so that they understand what kind of monster this is. So they understand we are different. But other than that, I mean, the framework of the agreement is not changed. That's all in all. So we continue with business as usual. I don't know if you want to add something, Siri.
No, thank you, Marit. I think that sums it up really well. But of course, Brexit has a major impact on because it left the internal market of the EU, also leaving the internal market of the EEA. So it's no longer part of the EEA agreement either, as you know. And as the EU, the EFTA states have also negotiated a free trade agreement with the UK regulating relationship, the future relationship after Brexit. But that is different than the EEA agreement and the EU assistance. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Is there another question in the audience before we go to the questions online? Yes. Maybe I will walk with the mic over there, but you could look at the question. What measures do the EEA EFTA countries often disagree on or find the most difficult to sort of come together on? And it was the EEA EFTA countries, so not with the EU.
It's muted, so you just turn it. Yeah, you want me to say something about that first?
Well, maybe we could go to the next question and then we can answer.
Good morning, and thank you very much for organizing this event. I'm Jonathan Better, EAS contact point in the EFTA working party. And I did have a question regarding the backlog. Were you able to identify a pattern in the transposition with regard to the various 4 areas of freedom areas?
Sorry, we were able to
identify a pattern in the transposition of the backlog by areas.
If we can scale it down to, yes, I think we can. We have some overviews of that. Unfortunately, I don't have that now. But as I said, obviously the big chunks of, or the big areas would also have bigger backlog, like financial services would be an obvious one. And we know that also in energy we've had substantial backlog. On transport, we've had something. We are waiting now for a chunk of legislation to be incorporated that will take away 60. So you know, because I think and this we could of course discuss with you later as well. You know where to find us. So you know, absolutely, we do have an overview of that, but it is actually linked to what you on the EU side is producing, because when you come with, you know. I mean, as one of our environment colleagues just said, we are expecting a tsunami on environment. So of course, this also follows both the amount of acts identified and a bit the backlog, because as I said, part of it is inherent. We don't start before you are already done. But yes, the big areas do also have the biggest backlog. And then to the question on what the EFTA states disagree on. I'm looking a bit at you, Gabriele. Do you have some? I don't know if there is something in particular we disagree on our side, but of course like between the three, I think it is more. You know, you have different priorities. You have different countries with different needs. So it's more to make it fit into not only the agreement, but also taking into account, you know, the specifics or the systems, or not specifics as such, like legal. I mean, it's nothing to do with that, but more like if there are things that we need to adjust again. So I think the main part is the fact that we need to have it into the agreement. So it's not so much what Norway thinks or Iceland thinks or Liechtenstein. It's just that it has to fit into that common ground that we have. Am I saying, yeah?
I would say I agree.
Yeah.
I think it's usually not disagreement, but it's just different interests.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have to make some adaptations or post-application for some countries rather than others.
Yeah.
But I would say that the 3 countries are very, they have a good cooperation and they usually agree.
Yeah. And just for those of you online, if you didn't hear that, basically, Gabriela agrees with me, so that's excellent. You know, there are some different interests, but this is not really, it's not because we have the 3 different countries, it's because we have to make it fit into that agreement, and sometimes, you know, some parties, you know, on financial services might be very important for Liechtenstein, so they want us to hire there, and maybe this is less of a priority as something else. But this is also where the Secretariat has an important role, to push and pull and to try and make those interests fit.
Thank you. We're actually getting quite a lot of questions online, but we only have time for one more, and I had promised the space to this gentleman here in the room.
Good morning. I'm Krasimir Nikolov. I just started working on Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein in the External Action Service. I have 2 questions. One is partially related to the issue about disagreements, but I put it in another form. Can you give examples? One example for a successful decision shaping, participation in decision shaping, where you manage to influence the EU side, and one example where you were less successful in influencing the EU side. And another question from your presentation, I deducted that the comments that you submit to the Commission seems to be an important document, because this is how you describe your views, interests, positions before the EU legislation is adopted. How is this document adopted internally? Here in the capitals, etc. Something about your internal cuisine. Thank you.
Thank you for excellent questions. Marit, you will start, and then Siri, you can.
Yes, absolutely. I wish I could say that the tiny little countries of Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein are really, you know, pointing out the directions of the EU. But I have to say, we actually had a trainee last year who wrote his master's thesis on our EFTA comments. That gave him, of course, a job here as well. So I think the point is, we are assessing the legislation proposals, or whatever we are writing about. And we try to identify areas where we think it's problematic, where we have different ideas, and so on. And then we, you know, our 3 countries agree. You will hear more about this in detail, but I will say very, very shortly. Yes, we actually have seen, you know, that we recognize text that we have, because sometimes we also propose text that to, like in the changes of after the trilogue, for instance. Having said that, I think as any work in our society is to try to influence, it's not about one voice. It's not about one EFTA comment. This is about, I think, you know, and that's why also we have close cooperation, or our member states also would meet and talk and discuss this with the member states, representatives of the member states as well. You know, if we have a direction like that and we agree on that, the EFTA comment as such would be often one out of many. So that's how it is. I will be very, very brief because I know that you will have it later on today, but basically the comment is drafted and agreed upon often in these working groups. Then there is a process. It's endorsed also higher up in our system, and then it is sent out to both Commission, Council, and the Parliament representatives. And it's also always on our EFTA website.